Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I will make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand. I will do all that I please. So, has anyone ever kind of imagined kind of sitting down at your computer, kind of writing a novel? What would you write it? I mean, how would you do it? What would you have an outline? Would you have an end in mind? Would you know what happened in chapter 10 when you were writing chapter 2? Would the details in the middle of the book be random, or would you be surprised? We've been discussing how the Bible is one story with 4 parts. And last week I mentioned that the Bible was written by as many as 40 different writers. Now that may be technically true, but if this is one story, how would the writer of chapter 1 know what's going to happen in chapter 2, much less the last chapter? How would Moses, who wrote Genesis, know what's going to happen in Judges or Jeremiah or Matthew or Revelation? How can this be one story with 40 authors? Is the Bible written by 40 authors or written by 40 writers but one author? Now, I want to take a step back because that's a big leap if you think about it. For me to say this is really one story, one author, how can I know? I mean, how can we know? How can we know if this is one story with one author or 40 authors just writing 40 random stories? And I want to kind of pose this out for everybody on here. What are some ways we can know if this indeed is this Bible is indeed one story written by one author rather than 40 authors with 40 books kind of pushed together? How would we what would we expect to look or see if we saw this was written by one author?
Similarity to the story.
What, Don? I'm sorry?
Similarities.
Yes.
The author.
Yeah, similarity between the stories. So there's some cohesion there. Okay, very good. What else?
They're all in agreement.
They're in agreement. That's right. They're not combating each other. That's there's not a fight there. What else?
History shows that stories they get wrote about are true. Have come true.
Say that again. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I hear that correctly.
So history. Stories in the Bible that have come true. All the different authors wrote about. They come true, and it's the way they said it would be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a little bit about where we're going today. I'm having a little bit of I'm getting some back feedback. I'm gonna mute you guys, so unmute when we have the conversation. I want to make sure that everybody kind of heard what Don just said. So the idea here is that the Bible is come true. The things that are in it are, if this was indeed written by one author, then the author is going to know how the last chapter will play out when the first chapter is written. We could see clues of future chapters in those early chapters. And the more specific those clues are, the more confidence we can have in this kind of one author theory. If God is who we think he is, God could show us the future because to him, it's as much as fact as the past is. Or maybe another way to look at it, God could show us the future so we could see him better. We've been going through this series called This Is One Story. And today I want to take a look at prophecy. And specifically, I want to look at the book of Daniel. Prophecy is nothing more than stating or telling what's going to happen in the future. And there is a lot of prophets in and out of the Bible. But are all prophets from God? And by the way, how do we know that? How do we know if all prophets are from God? How can we know if a prophet is from God?
Because they acknowledge him.
Okay, so they acknowledge him. They say they're from God. Okay, that's a good sign. Anything else?
And in the New Testament, they would acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God.
That's right. So if it's truly a prophet from God, they're going to acknowledge Jesus Christ. Really good point. Anything else? Yeah. So one way that I thought of, first, one way we could look is, did the prophecy come true? That's a good clue. However, getting something right doesn't necessarily mean something is true from God. For example, if I prophesize that the Kansas City Chiefs are going to win the Super Bowl and they won, would that prove I'm a prophet? No, they won last year. Their team looks strong this year. It's a likely, probable guess. However, if I said the Texans were going to win the Super Bowl, that would be a little bit more of a stretch. I mean, especially how they played the last 2 weeks. If I was going to say, if I were to say the Texans are going to win 21-14, okay, now you're getting my attention. However, if I was going to
They call you a prophet, but a false one.
you would be, if I predicted the Texans were going to win, you would be calling me a false prophet. Yeah, I'm afraid that's true. I haven't been able to wear my DeAndre Hopkins jersey all summer. I'm really still quite bitter about that. Anyway, however, if I was to say the Texans were going to win 5-2, which is a highly unlikely score, and on a last second safety, you'd think I'm nuts. But if it happened, you'd hire me to be your financial planner. Does that kind of make sense? The more specific the prophecy, the more likely the prophet is real. And remember, the prophet is sharing what God gave them. If God is the author and he gives us a clear, specific prophecy that comes true, then it's one way we can know he is the true single author of this one story. Is this tracking? Is my thinking kind of line up? Are you guys picking up what I'm putting out? The Old Testament is full of prophecy, and Daniel is mic drop, lights out, mind blowing, prophetic detail. I mean, if Daniel doesn't light your fire, guys, your wood's wet. And if you, we're going to read Daniel 9, but if you look at even Daniel 8, it reads like history. The only thing it's missing the names, but there's clear detail. It is so detailed. It has to be supernatural. It describes kingdoms and kings and battles that took place in the centuries after Daniel wrote it in about 500 BC. The details are nuts. But again, we're going to talk a little bit about chapter 9. And there's kind of three things that I want to talk about today. First, I want to look at the exact dates and details that are predicted. Second, there are some critics that suggest that because Daniel is so accurate, it must have been written after the fact. They suggest Daniel is a fraud. And then finally, I want to look at kind of the big picture. We can see the big picture in this story. So again, we're going to look at the detailed nature of the story. Can we trust Daniel? And can we see the big picture here? So again, let's do some backstory. Let's do some review. Israel had rejected God. They called him Lord, but they're not acting like he's God. They're worshiping idols. I even mentioned last week that they're doing perverted practices like child sacrifice, which is taking place just outside of Jerusalem. So God, just as he always said he was, he allows the He allows punishment. He allows the Assyrians to capture them. Then after a series of events, the Babylonians they now rule Israel. During this time, several famous heroes of the Bible emerge: Ezra, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Esther, and this prophet called Daniel. Daniel is taken capture and he's sent to Babylon. The king of Babylon has a plan. His plan is to rule and remain in power, or his way to remain in power is to assimilate the Jewish people. Let's make them Babylonians. He uses the school system. The king takes the young, bright teenagers and sends them to Babylonian universities and schools. Let's indoctrinate them. Let's teach them to think like us. Let's engulf them in Babylonian wisdom. Let's let our new education replace the old, antiquated religious teaching. I imagine that they suggest that their polytheistic religion is cool and hip. But Daniel, however, he does not reject God, the teaching of his ancestors. He has integrity and stays true to God. And through a series of famous stories, his loyalty to God causes him to be thrown into a furnace, into a den of lions. But his faith never wavers, and God never abandons him. If you're looking for an exciting book to study and learn, Daniel might be the ticket. And as we were discussing a second ago, it might be fun to discuss that in this group when we're done with this series. After Daniel is captured and sent away to Babylon, Jerusalem is besieged and destroyed, the temple destroyed, the people starve, the city is ruined. But as we discussed last week, Jeremiah 29 prophesies that Israel would be restored after 70 years. And Daniel is reading the writings. He's reading the letter from Jeremiah to the Israel captives who have been taken to Babylon. And he notices that the 70 years is almost done. And that's where this passage that we're going to read takes place. Daniel 9. In the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, a Mede by descent, who was made ruler by the Babylonian kingdom, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So I turned to the Lord God and pleaded with him in prayer and in petition and fasting and in sackcloth and ashes. So now remember, as we're reading this passage, Daniel has stayed true to God throughout, and Daniel has seen incredible miracles. If anyone trusts God, it's Daniel. And if anyone trusts that God keeps his promises, it's Daniel. But Daniel isn't arrogant. He looks around. He sees the powerful nation around him. He sees Babylon's might. And Daniel knows this is a promise will have to be supernatural. Daniel is humbled by this great author whose story is unfolding, and he's in the middle of it. Verse 4, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed, Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and have rebelled. We have turned away from our commands and laws. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. Lord, you are righteous, but this day we are covered by shame. The people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all Israel, both near and far, and all the countries where you have scattered us because of our unfaithfulness to you. We and our kings, our princes and our ancestors are covered with shame. Lord, because we have sinned against you. The Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the Lord our God and kept the laws he gave us through his servants, the prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned away, refusing to obey you. Therefore, the curses and sworn judgments written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out on us because we have sinned against you. You have fulfilled the words spoken against us and against our rulers by bringing on us great disaster. Under the whole heaven, nothing has ever been done like what is done to Jerusalem. Just as it is written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come on us. Yet we have not sought the favor of the Lord our God by turning away from our sins and giving attention to your truth. The Lord did not hesitate to bring the disaster on us. For the Lord our God is righteous in everything he does, yet we have not obeyed him. Now, verse 15, now, Lord our God, who brought your people out of Egypt with a mighty hand and who made yourself a name that endures to this day, we have sinned. We have done wrong. Lord, in keeping with all your righteous acts, turn away your anger and your wrath from Jerusalem, your city, your holy hill. Our sins and iniquities of our ancestors have made Jerusalem and your people an object of scorn for all those around us. Now, our God, hear the prayers and petitions of your servant. For your sake, Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, our God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make request of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Lord, listen. Lord, forgive. Lord, hear and act. For your sake, my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. By the way, that's some prayer. Anything kind of stick out about that prayer? I wanted to make sure that I thought that was cool. That was a really cool prayer. Anything kind of stand out to you guys?
I think it stood out to me is he consistently confessed the sins of the people and kept on saying, Lord, you don't owe us this. For your sake and for your people, redeem us.
Yeah. He is consistent. He's been consistent all through this whole thing. This prayer is a prayer of humility. This is a humble prayer. In fact, actually, this guy is a man of God. And if you look at verse 18, we do not make request, or we do not make request of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. This is the sinner's prayer, isn't it? Do not save us because of us, but save us because of you. You are merciful. If you want to know that prayer of salvation, Daniel's prayer is a model, isn't it?
Yeah. You don't hear something like this prayed nowadays.
That's a true statement. Yeah, in a lot of ways, you can see a lot of what's happening now. You see a lot of parallels between now and Daniel. Is this a prayer that we should be praying? Is this a prayer that our people, our land needs?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
I said we're in the same shape as they are.
Yeah. We in a lot of ways.
I'm surprised he doesn't send us to Russia or China.
To be indoctrinated by Russia or China University. That's another story for another day. And by the way, when you read this, when we move forward, God is going to hear Daniel in kind of a mind-blowing way. Verse 20, when I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill, While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight and about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and he said to me, Daniel, I have now come to you to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem and until the anointed one, the ruler comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. But it will be rebuilt with trenches or streets in a trench, but in times of trouble. And after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come to destroy the city and the sanctuary, the end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So let's break this down. Daniel is reading a letter from Jeremiah that God is going to restore Israel and Jerusalem after 70 years of captivity. It's been about 70 years. The time is almost up, and Daniel's been there the whole time. So, by the way, he's an old man, probably in his 80s at this point. Regardless, reading this letter causes Daniel to fall to his knees and pray. There's humility, there's faith. The prayer is passionate, and Daniel is in awe of God. That's what 70 years of trial and tribulation does. It makes a man of character. Daniel falls to his knees and he pleads with God for Israel's sake. And in the middle of the prayer, God sends a Gabriel, the angel, to reveal God's plan for Daniel and for us. Daniel is concerned about God's 70-year plan. What he gets is a much bigger plan, the 70 times 7-year plan. Now, take a step back. Some Bible versions call this 70 weeks. So if you're reading like a King James version, you may see that. It's called 70 weeks. But many scholars suggest that this word week is really just kind of a container, not a literal week. It's being used like what we might call a dozen. This means that there's 70 times 7 years or 490 years with one big break in the middle. Some people disagree with this, by the way, but it makes sense in context. 7 is the number of completion in the Bible. And this prophecy is about Israel and Jerusalem, which is what Daniel is praying for. It is called, many scholars call this the backbone of Bible prophecy. Of all the people on the planet, God has given the people of Israel, the family of Abraham and David, a special purpose. He's going to complete this promise through them. So first, the detail. Now, this passage is from Israel's perspective. As I was preparing for this, I listened to this podcast called Through the Word, and Chris Langham describes this section as kind of like a stopwatch. The analogy he uses is a stopwatch. And the stopwatch is going to start when the people go back to rebuild Jerusalem. Then God is going to pause the stopwatch, and then he's going to restart it again for the final 7 years. Now, I do have to say, there are multiple interpretations of this passage. I'm not going to pretend that I know for sure. And I think it'd be fun to go through this and study this again together in the future. But I would encourage you guys to research this for yourself. One theory that seems to make a lot of sense to me was put out by Sir Robert Anderson, who was the chief of criminal investigation for Scotland Yard. and he deciphered this passage. Now we know that there are 4 decrees to rebuild Israel, but there is one, Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 8, to rebuild Jerusalem. That would have taken place at 445 BC. So 7 weeks of years, or 49 years, tells us that Jerusalem we will rebuild with streets and trenches during a time of trouble. We see that exactly happen in the book of Nehemiah. Again, remember, next week, Lionel is going to actually teach us about the book. He's going to go through and discuss Nehemiah. Then there are 62 more weeks of years, or 434 years. Now, just stay with me for a second. And this was what Sir Anderson calculated. Using the 360-day Jewish calendar, that equates to 434 years. That equates to a date of 9 Nisan AD 30. Nisan is the first month of the Jewish calendar. The Passover, the calculated Passover of the year AD 30, would have been Nisan 14. So this date calculated by Sir Anderson, is about 5 days before the Passover in the year 30, or about when Jesus arrives at Jerusalem, which we call Palm 30. Now, even if we don't agree on the exact date, it's still unbelievably remarkable that Daniel could guess the year Jesus would die 500 years in the future. This passage is telling us the dates when the anointed one will be put to death and have nothing. And finally, it says in verse 26, the people of the ruler who come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. That happened in 70 AD by the Romans. At this point, God then stops the stopwatch. The time of the Jewish people pause. Jesus says there's a time of the Gentile when we were reading the book of Leviticus, I suggested there's this time in the history which I called it the summer harvest, or the church age. I believe we're in that church age. But one day, God is going to restart the stopwatch, the Jewish stopwatch, and he's going to finish this prophecy from Daniel 9. There's a final week of years, or 7 years in the middle of it. And he's going to put it, and it said, he's going to put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. I think the he here is the Antichrist. Again, this is just my opinion, but many scholars seem to agree. And we're going to tackle this final 7 years when we get to the book of Revelation, which we're going to look at in January. Daniel 9 is a remarkable prophecy, so much so that critics have stopped disputing the dates and now suggest that Daniel was not written by Daniel. The book of Daniel was not written by Daniel at all, but was actually written in about 50 AD. And it was only written as if Daniel wrote it. So I think it's a good question for us to ask. Can we trust Daniel? The book of Daniel was supposedly written by this captured Israelite in the 6th century BC. The events detailed take place between about 500 BC and 70 AD. About a year ago, I was talking to Kevin Key, who teaches the young adults, and they were studying Daniel. And one of the students said that their college professor told him that Daniel wasn't written in 500 BC, but after the events happened, likely in 50 AD. And the professor's rationale was that it was impossible for the events and the dates in Daniel to be that precise. And by the way, certainly if Daniel was indeed written before these events happened, then it would be more than luck. It would be supernatural. So this professor's theory, and it's a pretty common theory, is that this book is a fraud written to deceive us. Google this, by the way. There's a lot of really interesting points. But I'm going to make 2 quick points that I think dispute this. First of all, There's a famous historian called Josephus who wrote in the first century that Alexander the Great swept into Israel, and the Jewish high priest showed Alexander the Great this passage in Daniel about himself, about Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was shocked by the detail of his conquest as described in Daniel. So in awe, he decided not to destroy Israel. And again, exactly as predicted in the Bible. Josephus wrote this in the first century. And in historical terms, Josephus's writing so soon would make it very reliable. And this story about Alexander the Great would date the book of Daniel about 329 BC. And there are other sources with this exact story. And as a second proof, in a pretty amazing way, God gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. And a scroll of the book of Daniel was found and dated in 150 BC. Again, before many of these prophecies in Daniel had taken place. The historical evidence of Daniel being reliable is actually quite strong. Last point on this. I find it really ironic that it's within our modern universities that these questions about the book of Daniel continue. Remember, Daniel was sent to Babylon, to the Babylon universities, originally to destroy his beliefs in God and what had been taught. It sounds familiar, right? We're seeing those same things. We're seeing the same things happen today that happened to happened to Daniel. My third point here, again, my last point is, as we've seen multiple times before, we see God's big picture in these passages. Let's look at verse 24 and 26 again. Verse 24, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And then verse 26, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. First, that verse 26, what is that talking about? Who is this anointed one? And what happens to him? Does that sound familiar at all?
Yeah.
Who is this anointed one, do y'all think?
It's Jesus.
It's Jesus. And do we see this? Is he put to death? And will he have nothing? We see that exactly, right? That he's put to death. He's stripped. He has nothing. He has no. His pillow is a stone. I mean, he's even stripped naked on this cross. He has nothing when he dies. And again, this is 500 years before Jesus rides into Jerusalem. Over and over, these passages, the passages of the Old Testament, point us to Jesus Christ. The book, this Bible, this one story, it's the story of Jesus Christ, and we see it over and over. Now in verse 24, what was the purpose of these 77s? First it says, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin. What does that mean? What are these passages telling us? To finish transgression, to atone for wickedness, to bring everlasting righteousness. What is the purpose of these 77s? What is the purpose of Christ dying on that cross?
Bring us salvation.
To bring us salvation. That's exactly right. When it says to finish transgression, one day he's going to give us this power to resist sin, to not transgress God's law. This is God's plan to end sin. When he says to atone for wickedness, God is going to fulfill that covenant promised to Abraham. He's going to pay the penalty. He's going to atone for our past sins. We are made clean. And when it says he's going to bring everlasting righteousness, God is going to Satan and sin into the lake of fire. Imagine a world made perfect again. God is going to send his anointed one, his own son, to be put to death, to pay the death penalty we all deserve so we can be made clean and atone for our past sin and given the power to resist sin and make perfect this world again. This is indeed the backbone of Bible prophecy. At the beginning, I asked this question: if you were the author of an epic story, how would you write it? And if we keep with the same theme of God as an author, I want to ask a follow-up question. If God is the great author, how can we, the characters in this epic story, know this author? C.S. Lewis posed this question: can Hamlet know Shakespeare? C.S. Lewis suggested the only way for Hamlet to know Shakespeare would be if he wrote a character named Shakespeare. Then Hamlet could see Shakespeare. Hamlet could hear Shakespeare's voice. Hamlet could know Shakespeare. God wrote himself into this great story. His name is Jesus Christ. John 1, verses 1 through 2. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And then verse 14 in John, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. This book, the Bible, is one story. It's a story of creation, fall, restoration, and new creation. But it's also a story about Jesus Christ. The Old Testament is written so that we can see God when he shows up. And then the New Testament is so we can see God and see his plan. This is one story. It's the story of Jesus Christ.